The quiet town of Willow Creek had always been peaceful. Nestled between rolling hills and tall pines, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name and the sound of a car engine was as rare as a storm on a summer day. But today, that peace was about to be shattered by the unmistakable roar of motorcycle engines, an unwelcome intrusion that would change the life of one of its oldest residents forever. Maggie O'Neill, at 92 years old, had seen more than her fair share of loud noises and chaos in her lifetime. As a World War II veteran, she had witnessed the horrors of battle, the sound of gunfire, the screams of her comrades. Nothing could compare to the life she led now, peaceful, quiet, and solitary in her little home by the lake. She spent her days reading, walking, and tending to her garden. The only thing she truly needed was her memories of the past and the peace she had fought so hard for. But that afternoon, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of revving engines grew louder, echoing through the trees. She squinted into the distance. A group of bikers, 6 or 7, by the looks of it, came barreling down the dirt road leading to her house. She could see their dark, leather-clad silhouettes through the haze of dust they kicked up. Her heart skipped a beat. Maggie was no stranger to trouble. In fact, she had dealt with more than her fair share during her time in the military. But this was different. The bikers didn't slow down as they approached her house. They took the turn too fast, sending a spray of gravel flying onto her front porch. One of them, a burly man with a face full of tattoos and a rough expression, shouted something that Maggie couldn't quite make out. It wasn't an invitation to join their party, that was for sure. "Hey, old lady," one of them yelled, his voice dripping with mockery. "You planning to die of old age, or are we going to help you with that?" Maggie's jaw tightened. She had been through worse, much worse, in her life. But there was something about the sneer in his voice that made her blood boil. She didn't flinch, though. No, Maggie O'Neill was no stranger to adversity, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by a gang of unruly bikers. She stood up slowly, clutching her cane, and made her way down the steps of the porch, her gaze never leaving the bikers. The group seemed amused at first, laughing among themselves. They saw her as an easy target, a frail old woman they could poke fun at without any consequences. But Maggie had a history of dealing with people who underestimated her. She wasn't about to let these punks have their way. "Is there something you need?" Maggie's voice was steady, calm, and unshaken. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with bullies was to stand your ground. One of the bikers, a lanky man with a messy beard, walked up to her, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Yeah, actually," he sneered, "we need you to get out of the way. This place is ours now. You might want to pack up and leave before we get creative with you." Maggie's hands tightened around her cane, but she didn't move. The moment stretched, thick with tension. She could feel the familiar surge of anger rising in her chest, the kind of anger that came from years of fighting battles, both on the field and in her own life. "You'll have to do better than that," she said, her tone laced with a hint of something dangerous. "Because I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, there was silence. The bikers looked at each other, unsure how to respond to the old woman standing in front of them with the calm authority of someone who had seen much worse than they could ever imagine. But they weren't backing down. Not yet. The one who had spoken earlier grinned, stepping forward with a leer. "Oh, I think you'll change your mind soon enough. We're just getting started." Maggie wasn't afraid of them. She had fought enemies who were far more dangerous than these men, and she had survived. But even so, something about their arrogance made her uneasy. She had seen this kind of behavior before. When people thought they were invincible, when they believed they could take whatever they wanted without any repercussions. But Maggie knew better. She'd learned long ago that even the most invincible could be brought down with the right plan, and she wasn't about to let herself become another victim of their cruelty. As the bikers gathered around, starting to taunt her, Maggie's mind raced. She didn't have time to waste. Something needed to be done. Something that would put these punks in their place once and for all. But what? Maggie wasn't sure. All she knew was that she wasn't going to let them take her dignity. Not today. Not ever. With a sharp glance, she turned her back on them and made her way inside. There was something she had to do. A call she had to make. She didn't know exactly how it would turn out, but one thing was certain. Maggie O'Neill was about to fight back in a way they never expected. Maggie's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway of her house as she made her way to the small desk tucked in the corner of her living room. The old wood creaked under her weight, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, far beyond the aches in her bones or the fatigue that came with living 92 years. Her hand trembled as she reached for the phone, an old rotary model that had been with her for decades. She didn't use it much these days, preferring to spend her time with books or tending to her garden. But right now, this phone would be her lifeline, her connection to someone who would understand, someone who could help. Maggie's fingers hovered over the dial as memories flooded her mind. Memories of a different time, when she was young, full of fire and purpose. Her time in the military had been both the hardest and the most meaningful of her life. It wasn't just the battles she had fought or the medals she had earned. It was the people she had met, the bonds she had formed, and the lessons she had learned along the way. It was in those days that Maggie had learned what it truly meant to be strong. And it was those same lessons that she was going to need now. With a steadying breath, Maggie began to dial the number, one she hadn't dialed in years. Ring, ring. The sound seemed to stretch, echoing in her empty house. Maggie's hand tightened around the receiver, and her pulse quickened as the phone continued to ring. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for. Maybe she just wanted to hear a familiar voice, a voice from a past that felt so far away. Or maybe, just maybe, she was hoping for something more. A lifeline, a promise that things could be different. And then, the voice on the other end of the line broke through the silence. Maggie, is that you? The voice was gruff, but warm, instantly recognizable. It was Captain Roy Harrington, her commanding officer during the war. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, the memories of her time in service flooding her mind like a tidal wave. Roy had been more than a leader. He had been a mentor, a friend, someone she could trust with her life. "It's me, Roy," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need your help." Roy's tone shifted immediately, the concern in his voice unmistakable. "What's going on, Maggie? Are you okay?" Maggie hesitated for a moment, staring at the cracked wood of the floor. "I'm fine, Roy, but there's something happening here in Willow Creek. Some bikers, group of them, have been causing trouble. They're harassing me and the neighbors. And I don't know what to do. I'm not as young as I used to be, Roy. I can't fight this battle alone." She could almost hear Roy's sigh on the other end of the line. The silence stretched for a moment before he spoke again, his voice calm and firm. "Maggie, you're one of the toughest women I know. I've seen you face things that would have broken most people, and you came out on top every time. But you're not alone in this. You've got me. And if you need help, you know I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're safe." Maggie's heart swelled with gratitude. In the years since the war, she had lost touch with most of her comrades, but Roy had always been a constant, someone she could count on, no matter how many years had passed. "I don't know what to do, Roy," Maggie admitted. "I'm not the same woman I used to be. I don't know how to fight these men, not like I used to." Roy's voice softened. "You don't have to do this alone, Maggie. Let me make a few calls. I know people who can help, but I also want you to remember something. Strength isn't just about how much you can lift or how hard you can punch. It's about your will. It's about standing up, no matter what's in front of you, and showing the world that you're not going down without a fight." Maggie swallowed, feeling a lump form in her throat. The words struck her like a bolt of lightning, reigniting something inside her that she thought had long since faded. Maybe she wasn't the same woman she used to be, but that didn't mean she was powerless. "I'm not giving up," Maggie said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "I'll fight. I won't let them run me out of my own home." Roy chuckled softly. "That's the Maggie I remember. I'll take care of the rest, and we'll get this sorted out. Just remember, you're not alone in this. You never were." Maggie hung up the phone, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. She had made the right call. Roy would handle things, but the ball was in her court now. She couldn't afford to sit back and wait for someone else to fix things. She was going to have to take matters into her own hands, just like she had in the past. As she walked back out onto her porch, Maggie could hear the distant sound of the bikers' engines again. But this time, it didn't scare her. It didn't even make her flinch. They were just a small part of a much bigger picture, a picture that Maggie was ready to fight for. She wasn't just a 92-year-old woman anymore. She was a veteran, a warrior who had lived through hell and come out stronger. And she wasn't going to let a gang of bikers tear down the life she had built for herself. No, not today. Maggie O'Neill had faced much worse than this, and she had always found a way to come out on top. The next day, the bikers returned. Maggie could hear them long before they appeared, their engines growling like wild beasts as they made their way down the dirt road. She had spent the morning preparing herself, mentally, physically, and emotionally, for what was coming. Roy's call had given her the strength to stand her ground, but Maggie knew that standing tall was only the beginning. She stepped out onto her porch again, this time without hesitation. The warm afternoon sun beat down on her weathered skin, and she closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a steady breath. The world around her seemed still, almost peaceful, but the hum of the bikers' engines quickly shattered that illusion. The group rounded the corner, their bikes roaring as they slowed to a stop in front of her house. This time, Maggie wasn't alone. She had a plan, and she wasn't afraid to carry it out. As the bikers dismounted their motorcycles, she stood tall, gripping her cane in one hand, the other hand resting on her hip. The leader, the burly man who had taunted her the day before, looked her up and down, a smirk still plastered across his face. Well, if it isn't the old lady again. You still think you can handle us, huh? Maggie didn't flinch. I don't need to handle you, son, she replied coolly, her voice as steady as a rock. But I'll be damned if I let you and your crew ruin my peace. The biker's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He stepped closer, looming over her. You really think you can stand up to us, huh? What's a 92-year-old woman going to do? You should have just stayed in the house where you belong. Maggie's heart raced, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. She had been through far worse than this. She had fought wars, faced death, and survived. And this gang of punks? They were nothing compared to the battle she'd already won. I belong right here, in my home, Maggie replied, her voice quiet but firm. And you'd better turn around and get off my property before you make a big mistake. The biker laughed, his deep, throaty chuckle filling the air. A mistake? We're just here to have some fun. You'll learn to get out of our way, old lady. We'll make sure of it. Maggie's gaze never wavered. The fire she had buried deep within herself over the years was starting to stir. She had faced enemies much more dangerous than these men. The war had taught her how to handle aggression, how to outwit opponents, and how to take control of any situation. You're right about one thing, Maggie said, her voice low and threatening. You're here to have fun, but it's not going to be the kind of fun you're used to. The leader of the gang squinted at her, trying to figure out what she meant. But Maggie wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of explaining herself. No, she had something else planned, something that would get their attention. As if on cue, Maggie stepped back and reached for the old leather bag that sat beside her front door. She pulled out a small metal box, no bigger than a lunchbox, and held it up for the bikers to see. It was weathered, beaten by years of use, but the logo on the side was unmistakable, a symbol that meant something to anyone who had served in the military. Does this look familiar to you? She asked, her voice hardening. The leader's face changed. He took a step back, his eyes widening for a split second. Maggie could see the moment of recognition in his eyes. The symbol was one of the most respected in military circles. It had been stamped on the crates of supplies she had delivered during the war, and it was a sign of authority, a symbol of leadership. The box wasn't just any container. It was a veteran's military supply case used to store classified documents, tools, and other critical items. Where did you get that? The biker demanded, his voice suddenly uneasy. What is that? Maggie smirked, feeling the power shift ever so slightly. She had the upper hand now. I fought for this country, and the people who served with me, they're not people you want to mess with. For a moment, the bikers stood silent, unsure of how to respond. The leader eyed the box warily, but Maggie didn't give him the chance to recover. I'm not afraid of you, she said flatly, and I won't let you or anyone else threaten me or my town. You can try, but you'll regret it. The biker shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering. He didn't want to seem intimidated, But Maggie could see the hesitation in his eyes. These weren't just some random thugs. There was something about Maggie's unwavering confidence, the weight of her history, that had made them second-guess themselves. Finally, after a tense pause, the leader let out a growl. "We're not done here, old woman. You're making a big mistake." Maggie didn't flinch. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Now get off my property." With a snarl, the bikers mounted their bikes again, and one by one, they sped off, their engines roaring as they disappeared down the road. Maggie stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. As the last biker faded into the distance, Maggie allowed herself a small smile. The first round was hers. She wasn't done yet, though. This was just the beginning. The bikers would be back. She knew that. But Maggie O'Neill wasn't going anywhere, and she wasn't afraid to fight for what she had worked her entire life to build. Maggie couldn't sleep that night. The adrenaline from her confrontation with the bikers was still coursing through her veins. Her hands, though steady most of the time, had started to tremble again when she tried to pour herself a glass of water. She set the glass down with a sigh. This wasn't the same as facing down a German soldier in a trench or standing on a battlefield where every breath felt like it could be your last. This was different. It was personal. She sat down in her favorite chair, a worn armchair by the window that had been hers for over 50 years. The fading moonlight cast long shadows across the room, but Maggie barely noticed. Her mind was far away, back in the war, back to a time when her life was filled with purpose, back when she had been part of something bigger than herself. But now, her world had become quieter. It had become her little house on the lake, her quiet garden, and her afternoon walks. No more chaos. No more threats. She had earned this peace, hadn't she? Maggie shook her head, trying to rid herself of the thoughts that gnawed at her. There was no going back. The bikers had made their move, and they weren't going to stop. They were bullies, nothing more, and Maggie had been through far worse than the likes of them. As the hours ticked by, Maggie's thoughts circled back to one thing: Roy's promise. He would handle it. He would make the calls. But Maggie knew she couldn't just sit around and wait for someone else to fix things. She had to be ready for whatever came next. The next morning, she woke early, as she always did. The sun hadn't yet risen, but Maggie was already on her feet, preparing for the day ahead. She pulled on her boots and a thick sweater, her favorite green one, the one her late husband had bought for her when they were young. She smiled softly at the memory. As she made her way to the kitchen, she stopped by the window and glanced out at the road leading up to her house. The morning was still and quiet. There was no sign of the bikers yet, but Maggie knew that wouldn't last long. They would return. They always did. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, her mind still working. There was a nagging feeling in her chest, a sense of impending danger. She had fought in wars, survived battles that had tested her in ways most people couldn't imagine. But this felt different. The stakes were personal now. These weren't just faceless enemies. They were real, living, breathing people who thought they could walk all over her. And Maggie O'Neill didn't take kindly to being walked on. A knock on the door broke her from her thoughts. Maggie stood up, her cane tapping softly against the floor, and walked to the door. When she opened it, she found Roy standing there, wearing his usual weathered leather jacket and a look of determination on his face. "Roy," Maggie said, a wave of relief washing over her. "What are you doing here?" Roy grinned, stepping inside. "I promised I'd help, didn't I?" Maggie nodded, closing the door behind him. "You did, but I didn't expect you to show up in person." "I figured you might need a little backup," Roy said, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced wariness of a man who had seen too much. "And I don't like leaving things unfinished. I've made a few calls, Maggie. These guys, they're not just some random group of bikers. They're part of something bigger." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, something bigger?" Roy took a seat at the table across from her. "They're part of a gang that's been stirring up trouble in several towns. They've been running protection rackets, trying to intimidate small businesses and older folks like yourself into paying them off. They think they can just roll in and take whatever they want, but I'm not going to let that happen. Not on my watch." Maggie stared at him for a long moment, absorbing what he was saying. She had always known there was more to the bikers than met the eye, but she hadn't realized just how deep their reach extended. You think they're part of something bigger than just a group of local troublemakers? Maggie asked, her voice low, almost to herself. Roy nodded. Exactly. And I'm guessing you've been on their radar for a while. They saw you as an easy target, but you don't strike me as the type to back down from a challenge. Maggie raised an eyebrow. I'm not backing down from anything, Roy. I figured, Roy said with a smile. But we need to be prepared. They'll come for you again, and next time, they won't be so quick to leave. I've got a few friends I can count on. I'll make sure we're ready for them. Maggie's thoughts raced as she processed everything Roy had said. This wasn't just about a few punks trying to bully her. It was about something much bigger. Something that could affect the whole town if it went unchecked. She stood up slowly, her resolve hardening. So, what's the plan? Roy stood with her, a glint of approval in his eyes. First, we get some intel. We need to know who's pulling the strings. Then, we make sure you're protected. No more surprises. We'll deal with the bikers, but we need to strike first. If we wait for them to come back at full force, we'll be playing catch-up. Maggie nodded, feeling a surge of energy she hadn't felt in years. The situation was far from ideal, but it wasn't hopeless. If Roy was right, and this gang had connections, then they weren't going to go down easily. But that didn't mean she couldn't fight back. We're not letting them take over my town, Roy, Maggie said firmly, her voice steady and determined. Not while I'm still breathing. Roy gave her a sharp nod. That's the spirit, Maggie. We've got work to do. With that, they set the plan in motion. Maggie wasn't going to wait for the bikers to make their next move. She was going to take control of the situation, just as she always had. This wasn't just about protecting her home anymore. It was about sending a message. Willow Creek wasn't going to be bullied, and Maggie O'Neill wasn't going to be a victim. Not today. Not ever. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Maggie and Roy drove through the quiet streets of Willow Creek. Roy had put out a few feelers and was now taking Maggie to meet one of his old contacts. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the way Roy talked, she knew this wasn't just some simple favor. The bikers, or rather the gang they were a part of, had been targeting other small towns, and it seemed they were good at making people scared enough to back down. But Maggie wasn't like those people. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on her. It wasn't just about her home anymore. It was about protecting her town, her neighbors, the place she had lived and loved for so many years. She wasn't going to let anyone tear it apart. Roy's truck rolled down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the twilight. It was getting late, and the town felt emptier than usual, almost too quiet. Maggie glanced over at Roy, who was focused on the road, his expression set in a way that told her he wasn't taking this lightly. We're almost there, Roy said, his voice steady but with an edge of determination. This guy's been through his fair share of trouble. He's seen what these gangs can do, and he's not the type to run from a fight. He owes me a favor, and he's going to help us out. Maggie nodded, her fingers gripping the seat beneath her. I'm not scared, Roy, but I'll admit, I didn't expect things to go this far. I didn't think these guys were part of something bigger. Roy gave her a sidelong glance, his eyes sharp. Most people don't. They think it's just some local trouble, but these bikers, they've got connections, money, and influence. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep coming. The truck rolled to a stop outside a dilapidated barn on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place Maggie had passed by 100 times, but never thought twice about. The windows were dark, and the whole structure had a sense of decay to it, but Maggie could sense something in the air. She wasn't sure if it was the setting or just the weight of what they were about to do, but she felt a flicker of apprehension. Roy turned off the engine, and the two of them stepped out into the cool evening air. "Stick close to me," he muttered as he led her to the barn door, which creaked as it opened. Inside, a few dim lights flickered overhead, revealing a group of men clustered around a table. "Roy," one of the men called out, his voice deep and gruff. "It's been a long time." Roy grinned. "Not long enough, Billy. You still alive, I see." Billy stood up from the table and clapped Roy on the back, his massive frame making him seem almost larger than life. His face was weathered, marked with the kind of scars that only came from years of hard living. "I'm still kicking, old friend." You brought backup? This is Maggie, Roy said, motioning to the woman beside him. Maggie, this is Billy. He's got a lot of experience with these kinds of problems. Billy gave Maggie a look that was somewhere between respect and curiosity. Nice to meet you, Maggie. If you're here with Roy, you must be as tough as he says. Maggie raised an eyebrow. I've been through my fair share of trouble. Billy nodded slowly, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. I can tell. You've got that fire in your eyes. I like that. He gestured to the table behind him. We've got some intel on the gang you're dealing with. They've been moving through towns, setting up protection schemes, and causing trouble for anyone who doesn't fall in line. They've been getting bolder. Roy crossed his arms. And we're going to make sure they know they picked the wrong town to mess with. Billy's eyes glinted with approval. That's what I like to hear. But we need to be careful. These guys play dirty. If they think they're losing control, they'll escalate, and we need to be ready for that. Maggie stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. I've been ready. I don't care how dirty they play. I'm not going to let them take my home. Billy gave her a thoughtful look. That's the spirit. But listen, we've got more work to do. We've got to track their moves, figure out who's pulling the strings, and get ahead of them. They're not going to stop until they get what they want. Roy nodded in agreement. That's why we're here. Maggie's tough, but we need to be smart. I've got people who can help with the intel. We'll hit them hard, but we need to know where to strike. The group spent the next hour strategizing, laying out the details of their plan. Billy had access to information that Maggie hadn't even considered, about gang members who operated under the radar and how to disrupt their operations without being caught. Roy had a network of old allies who could help with surveillance and getting word out to the right people. Maggie listened intently, absorbing everything she could. She might have been older, but she wasn't about to let anyone think she was out of the fight. Every piece of information was crucial. Every move mattered. By the time they left the barn, the plan was in motion. Billy and his crew would be watching the bikers, gathering intel, and sending updates as soon as they had something concrete. Roy had made sure the bikers wouldn't see them coming. As they walked back to the truck, Roy turned to Maggie, his expression serious. You're not alone in this, Maggie. We've got your back, and we're not going to let them win. Maggie gave him a firm nod. I'm not going down without a fight. And just like that, with the help of her old friends and allies she never expected, Maggie knew she had a fighting chance. The bikers had made a big mistake by thinking they could scare her off. She had an army of people behind her now, and it wasn't just about standing her ground anymore. It was about striking back. The days following their meeting at Billy's barn were tense. Maggie kept her usual routine. Mornings spent on her porch, afternoons in her garden, and quiet nights by the fire. But every movement felt weighted. Every sound seemed amplified. She knew the bikers were out there, lurking, waiting for their next chance. And Maggie couldn't afford to let her guard down. Roy's plan was in full swing. He had set up surveillance, and Maggie now found herself with a small team of eyes watching the bikers' every move. She never imagined her life would come to this, spending her days worrying about gang members and their schemes. But she knew that she had no choice. She couldn't back down. Each evening, Roy would check in with updates. They learned a few things about the bikers, their routes, where they gathered, and who was really calling the shots. Maggie's instinct was right. They weren't just some local troublemakers. They were part of a larger operation that extended far beyond Willow Creek. Their leader, a man named Jax Cortez, had a reputation that sent shivers down anyone who had heard of him. His gang wasn't just about intimidation. It was about control. And Maggie wasn't going to let him take control of her town. One afternoon, Maggie was tending to her roses when she noticed Roy's truck pull up the dirt driveway. He stepped out, looking more serious than usual. Maggie straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's the news?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with anticipation. Roy didn't waste any time. "We've got eyes on Jax. He's making a move. We think he's trying to push into town to make an example out of you." Maggie felt her chest tighten. What kind of move? Roy pulled a map from his jacket pocket and spread it across the table on her porch. He pointed to a spot just outside town, a secluded area near the old mill. "We've had a couple of eyes on him. He's meeting with some new people there. Folks who've been in the shadows, staying off the grid. We don't know much about them yet, but they're clearly important. Maggie's mind raced. And you're sure this is where he's going to be? Roy nodded. We've confirmed it. He's there right now. Maggie didn't hesitate. We go in now. Roy stopped her with a hand on her arm. Maggie, this isn't just about you anymore. We need to be smart about this. We've got the upper hand for now, but we don't know what Jax's backup looks like. This isn't a fight we want to jump into blindly. Maggie took a deep breath, fighting the urge to rush into action. She knew Roy was right. They needed a strategy, not just blind courage. What's the plan, then? Roy scanned the map, then looked up at her. We'll keep the eyes on them for a few more hours. Let them think everything's normal. Then we'll move in, quietly, no noise. We've got to take them by surprise. Maggie nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her. And if it doesn't go as planned? Roy's face hardened. If it doesn't go as planned, we improvise. We don't back down. You've already made it clear you're not going anywhere, Maggie. This is our town, too. She gave him a small smile, grateful for his unwavering support. Let's do it. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Roy gathered a small group of trusted allies, people from Willow Creek who had lived through their own battles, whether on the streets or in their personal lives. They were ready to fight for their town. And Maggie, despite her age and all the years of quiet life behind her, was ready to lead them. As dusk began to settle over the valley, the small team gathered in the woods near the old mill. The shadows of the trees stretched long, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Maggie could hear the distant roar of the bikes, growing louder with each passing second. The bikers were moving. Roy signaled for everyone to get into position, his hand low and steady. The group was split, each person stationed in the trees or behind the rocks, their eyes on the mill in the distance. Maggie was at the farthest point, just outside the perimeter of their movement, where she had a clear view of the old building. The wind was calm, but Maggie's nerves buzzed like electricity. She could see the lights of the bikers' motorcycles now, their red and orange glow cutting through the twilight. Jax was there. She could see him, flanked by his men. The air seemed to thicken as Maggie squinted, trying to make sense of the movement. She could see the men exchanging something, perhaps money or goods. It was hard to tell from this distance, but whatever it wasn't good. We move now, Roy whispered into her ear, his voice barely audible over the breeze. Maggie's heart pounded as she nodded. It was time. She had to act quickly. The team moved as one, silently closing in on the gang from all sides. Maggie kept low to the ground, her every step calculated, her cane acting as a silent extension of her movements. She couldn't afford to make a sound. They were close now. Maggie could hear the men talking in low voices, not realizing they were being surrounded. Jax was still in the center, barking orders, his voice full of authority. It was hard not to admire the way he commanded his men, but Maggie wasn't going to let that stop her. Roy tapped her shoulder, and Maggie knew it was time. She stood tall, stepping out from the shadows, her cane held firmly in her hand. Jax, she called out, her voice sharp and strong. The bikers froze. Jax turned around, his eyes narrowing as he saw Maggie standing there, unafraid. He let out a low chuckle, the sound almost mocking. Maggie O'Neill, Jax said, his voice dripping with disdain. Still playing the hero, huh? You're really going to try and stop me? Maggie stood her ground, her chest rising and falling with each steady breath. I'm not trying to stop you, Jax, she said coolly. I will stop you. A tense silence fell over the group as they all sized each other up. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was a battle, and Maggie was ready to win it. The morning after the showdown felt like a dream. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. The dust had settled, and Maggie stood on her porch, watching the sun rise over Willow Creek. There was a sense of calm in the air, but it wasn't the kind of calm that comes after peace. It was the kind that follows a storm, the stillness before the next wave. Roy's truck pulled up the driveway, and Maggie watched him step out, his usual confident stride tempered with the weight of the night's events. He walked toward her, his face serious, but not without the familiar glint of respect. You did it, he said, his voice quieter than usual, as he joined her on the porch. Maggie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out at the quiet town. The same town that had been disrupted, threatened, and now stood on the edge of something new. "We did it," she finally said, her voice carrying the weight of their victory. "But it's not over, is it?" Roy shook his head. "No, it's not. Jax and his crew are part of something bigger. They won't just forget about last night. But right now, we've sent a message. And that message is clear. Willow Creek isn't someplace they can come in and take over. We'll protect it." Maggie nodded, her eyes steely with determination. "I'm not going anywhere, Roy. I've fought too long and too hard for this town. No one's taking it from me. Not now, not ever." Roy smiled, a glint of admiration in his eyes. "I know. That's why we're all behind you." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Maggie met with the local sheriff, a kind man named Jim who had been following the situation closely, even though he had been limited in what he could do. He was thankful for the help Maggie and Roy had provided. It was clear that, despite the sheriff's years of service, he was out of his depth when it came to organized crime like Jax's gang. "We'll need to keep watch," Jim told her. "The bikers might be down for now, but they won't stay down for long." Maggie agreed. The town needed more than just protection. It needed a plan, a way to stand strong and defend itself without relying solely on outside help. And that's where Maggie knew she could make the difference. She might be older, but she wasn't naive. The town needed leadership, and she wasn't about to let anyone else claim that mantle. By the afternoon, a handful of local families had gathered in the town square. News of the gang's retreat had spread, and many felt a sense of relief. But Maggie could see the unease in their eyes. They weren't sure what came next, and she couldn't blame them. She felt the same way. Roy stood beside her as she stepped onto the small stage that had been set up for town meetings. The familiar faces of the people she had grown up with watched her, waiting for her to speak. She cleared her throat and took a moment before addressing the crowd. "I know many of you are wondering what happens next. You've seen what happened with Jax and his gang. You saw that they thought they could walk in here, intimidate us, and take what wasn't theirs. But you also saw that we don't back down. This town is ours, and we'll protect it." She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. "We've got more work to do. This isn't over. We've got to stay strong and stay vigilant. But I want you to know that we're not in this alone. We've got each other, and we've got the strength of this town. We'll keep watching, keep fighting, and make sure no one ever tries to take Willow Creek again." The crowd erupted in applause, the sense of unity and pride palpable. Maggie could see the hope returning to their eyes, the same hope that had driven her to stand up to Jax in the first place. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back, together. As the meeting drew to a close, Maggie felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Roy standing beside her, a rare look of pride in his eyes. "You're a hell of a leader, Maggie," Roy said, his voice warm but sincere. "I don't think anyone could have done what you did." Maggie gave him a small, knowing smile. "I don't know about that, Roy. I just know that I couldn't do it alone. We all had to fight, and we're not finished yet." The evening came quickly, and Maggie found herself back on her porch, the air growing cooler as night fell. She stared up at the stars, her mind racing with what had just happened and what was still to come. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Billy, the man who had helped them with intel about Jax's gang. Maggie opened it, her eyes scanning the text. "They've started making moves again. Not here yet, but keep your eyes open. We're still watching. Stay ready." Maggie sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. The fight was far from over. But as she sat there on her porch, looking out over Willow Creek, she realized something important. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had allies. She had friends. And most importantly, she had a community that was willing to fight with her. She wasn't just a 92-year-old woman anymore. She was the heartbeat of Willow Creek. The following days were a mixture of quiet vigilance and small victories. The town of Willow Creek was buzzing with the aftermath of the standoff. There were whispers in every corner of the town, talk of how Maggie had stood her ground, how she had refused to be intimidated. But even with the momentum on their side, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over. In fact, it felt like the calm before something far worse. She continued her routine, but the weight of responsibility had shifted in her bones. She was no longer just the town's older matriarch. Now, she was its protector. The knowledge that Jax Cortez and his gang would return hung over her like a dark cloud. And Maggie wasn't about to let them have an inch of the town she had fought for, built, and loved for so long. Roy was there every step of the way. His unwavering support had made all the difference. He had a way of keeping things grounded, of reminding Maggie that while the battle was personal for her, it was also bigger than just her. This was about the community they had all worked to build. And Maggie knew that. But the more she thought about it, the more it felt like the stakes were rising. This wasn't just about her town anymore. It was about something much larger. Maggie met with Sheriff Jim again the next morning, trying to figure out their next move. They were sitting at the sheriff's office, papers strewn across the table, making plans to bolster the town's defenses. "We've got eyes on the outskirts of town," Jim said, looking through a stack of notes. "But that's not enough. We need to start fortifying Willow Creek. We don't know what Jax's crew is really capable of." Maggie nodded. "I've been thinking about that too. We need more than just watchful eyes. We need a plan for the long term. And we need to be prepared for when they come back, because they will." Jim sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, we're spread thin, but maybe this is the break we need. If we can get more support from the neighboring towns, maybe we can bring in reinforcements." "That's a good start," Maggie said. "But we also need to make sure that everyone here knows what's at stake. This can't just be about us fighting. This has to be about the entire town taking responsibility." Sheriff Jim nodded in agreement. "I'll start making calls. Maybe we can rally the nearby towns. Get some local law enforcement and volunteers who can come help fortify the area." Maggie looked over at him, a thought stirring in her mind. "We can do better than that. We've got people here. People who know the land, who know the town. We don't need outsiders to protect us. We just need to get them organized." Jim's expression softened. "You've got a point. It's about getting people involved. We've got people who can help with the town's defenses, the businesses, the homes. We'll start small and make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." As they discussed the plans, Maggie's thoughts kept drifting back to Jax and his gang. They hadn't just come to Willow Creek to make a quick buck. They'd come with a purpose. And Maggie was certain that Jax wasn't going to give up that easily. He'd been humiliated when they ran him out of town. It wouldn't be long before he returned to finish what he started. Later that afternoon, Maggie walked around town, checking in on local businesses and speaking to residents. Everyone was still feeling the aftereffects of the night they stood up to the bikers. Some were still shaken, others were eager to put it behind them, but everyone was starting to realize that things wouldn't return to normal anytime soon. At the local diner, Maggie sat down with some of the town's longtime residents, people who had been here long before she had. They were all talking, laughing lightly, but beneath the surface, Maggie could see the nervousness, the unease. People were scared, and that scared her more than anything. She had always prided herself on being strong for others, on never letting fear show. But now, even she could feel it creeping in, that sense that no matter how hard she fought, the world was changing around her, and she wasn't sure if they could change fast enough to protect themselves. "I heard the bikers are making their move again," said Sarah, a local shop owner who had been in Willow Creek for over 40 years. "My son saw them parked outside of the mill yesterday. They've been coming and going." Maggie's heart sank. She had been waiting for this. "What kind of movement are we talking about?" Sarah lowered her voice. "They're not just hanging around anymore. They're gathering something. I don't know what, but it doesn't feel right." Maggie leaned in, listening closely. "Do you know how many of them there are?" Sarah hesitated. "It's hard to say, but it's not just the usual crew. There are other vehicles, other people. I think they've been bringing in supplies or something." Maggie's mind raced as she processed the information. This wasn't just a random meeting. This was organized, deliberate. Jax wasn't just regrouping. He was planning something bigger, and she needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. She stood up from the table, her decision made. "I'm going to see for myself." As Maggie made her way toward the edge of town, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what was ahead of her. She had already confronted Jax once before, but this time, she wasn't just trying to stop him. She was preparing for war. Roy had warned her that Jax's gang was part of a larger network, a much more dangerous operation. And if that was true, this wasn't just a matter of protecting her town. It was about protecting everyone. As Maggie approached the mill, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something felt off. The area was eerily quiet, no sounds of the usual bustle of the town around her. She knew she had to be cautious. Stepping quietly through the trees, she crouched low to the ground, using the cover of night to hide her movements. From her vantage point, Maggie could see the bikes lined up, a dozen or more parked in a semicircle around a large, rusty shipping container. The shadows of men loomed over the container, but there was something else, something that made Maggie's heart race. A white van was parked nearby. Several men were unloading boxes into the container. Maggie couldn't make out what was inside, but she could tell this was no small operation. This wasn't just a group of bikers making trouble. They were building something. She pulled out her phone and snapped a few pictures, careful to stay out of sight. She knew she had to get this information back to Roy and Sheriff Jim. They needed to know what Jax was planning. But before she could turn to leave, one of the bikers looked in her direction. Her heart skipped a beat. The last thing she needed was to be seen. She dropped to the ground, holding her breath, praying he hadn't noticed her. The biker slowly scanned the area, his eyes lingering for just a moment on the trees where Maggie was hiding. Her muscles tensed, ready to spring into action, but then he turned back toward the others. Maggie waited for what felt like an eternity before she finally allowed herself to breathe. She'd been lucky this time, but how many more times could she avoid being discovered? The shadows of the night felt deeper now. The war was coming, and it was clear. Maggie couldn't keep hiding in the shadows for much longer. Maggie didn't sleep much that night. Her mind raced with everything she had witnessed at the mill. Whatever Jax and his crew were planning, it wasn't going to end with a few stolen supplies or a simple raid. The level of secrecy and organization spoke to something bigger, something that threatened not just Willow Creek, but the surrounding areas too. She spent the next morning preparing, gathering her thoughts and organizing her next steps. The photos she'd taken of the men unloading the van were crucial evidence. Maggie knew she had to get them to Roy and Sheriff Jim immediately. If they could decipher what was being transported, they might be able to stop Jax's plan before it fully took shape. By midday, Maggie met with Roy at the old diner, their usual spot for strategy sessions. Roy had brought along Sheriff Jim, who was looking as tired as Maggie felt. They sat in a corner booth, the air heavy with tension. Maggie slid the photos across the table to Roy, who immediately studied them. His brow furrowed as he examined the images, his finger tracing the outlines of the boxes and the men in the shadows. "Looks like they're moving something big," Roy muttered. "I don't recognize the boxes, but the setup's suspicious. And why so many people for a little bit of cargo?" Jim leaned in, squinting at the photos. "It's not just about the cargo. They're trying to keep it under wraps. This isn't the behavior of a small-time gang. They've got something they're preparing to move, or something they're hiding." Maggie took a deep breath, her mind connecting the dots. "I saw a white van there, loaded up with boxes, but it wasn't just that. There were more bikers than usual, and I got the feeling they were waiting for something. Not to mention that shipping container. There's no way it's just for storage. They're using it to conceal whatever they're really up to." Roy scratched his chin, thinking hard. "You're right. They're setting up for something big. We need to figure out exactly what they're planning before they act on it." Sheriff Jim nodded grimly. "We can't afford to wait and see. I'll call in a few favors with some of the neighboring counties. We need backup, and we need it fast. This thing could spiral out of control if we don't stop them now." Maggie placed her hands on the table, steadying herself. She was no stranger to uncertainty, but this was different. The gravity of what they were facing weighed heavily on her. "I'm not just sitting on the sidelines for this one," Maggie said, her voice firm. "If we're going after them, I want to be in the thick of it. I've got everything to lose here." Roy looked at her with a mixture of concern and respect. "Maggie, you've done more than enough already. You don't need to put yourself at risk." Maggie shook her head, locking eyes with him. "I've been in the fight my whole life. If I sit back now, I'm just as guilty as those who let the bad guys win. No one's going to take this town from me, not while I'm still standing." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. They all knew Maggie's resolve, and they all knew the kind of fight she was willing to take on. With a quiet nod, Roy stood up. All right, we do this together. Let's get our plans set. As they began to make preparations, the town buzzed with its own sense of anticipation. People were nervous, but there was also a new sense of unity. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt that the people of Willow Creek were ready to fight for what was theirs, to stand beside her. The word quickly spread. Jax and his gang wouldn't be allowed to run roughshod over their town any longer. Willow Creek wasn't just a place to survive. It was a place to live, to thrive, and to protect. Maggie worked closely with Sheriff Jim and Roy, finalizing the details of their plan. They needed to act fast, but they also needed to be smart. They couldn't rush into this unprepared. The element of surprise was their best weapon. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the plan was set. Maggie had rallied some of the town's most trusted residents, people who were more than willing to take up arms to defend their homes. The local volunteers, farmers, and business owners who had stayed through thick and thin were ready to join the fight. But there was still something nagging at Maggie, something that didn't sit right. She knew Jax and his crew would be expecting retaliation, but would they come straight for the town? Or were they planning something more insidious, something that would hurt the people of Willow Creek when they least expected it? That night, Maggie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts kept drifting to the upcoming confrontation, her mind running through every possible scenario. She had lived through so much already, losing friends, fighting battles, and watching everything she loved be tested. This town had given her strength, and now it was time to return the favor. Just as Maggie began to drift off, her phone buzzed, breaking the silence of her thoughts. It was a message from Billy. They're moving again. This time, they're headed east. Looks like they're looking for a place to stash whatever they've got. I've got eyes on them, but we need to move now. Her heart skipped a beat. East. The mill was to the west. But if they were heading east, that meant they were planning something else. Something more. Maggie jumped out of bed, her pulse racing. She immediately called Roy. We need to move now. They're on the move again. East. They're trying to stash whatever they're transporting. We can't let them get ahead of us. Roy's voice was sharp, but calm. Got it. We'll meet you at the edge of town in 30 minutes. Be careful, Maggie. Maggie didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, checked that her phone was fully charged, and headed out into the night. As she walked toward her truck, the weight of the moment hung over her. This was the calm before the storm, and there was no going back now. The town of Willow Creek had united. But now, it was time to face the enemy head-on. The night air was thick with anticipation as Maggie drove through the empty streets of Willow Creek. The town that had once felt so safe, so predictable, was now on the brink of something much larger than any of them could have expected. Maggie gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, her mind focused on what lay ahead. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Roy. We're on our way. Stay sharp. We don't know how many of them are out there. Maggie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had lived through war, loss, and heartache. But this felt different. This was personal. This was about her town, about the people she loved. No one was going to take that from her. As Maggie pulled up to the edge of town, she saw Roy's truck parked near the old barn. Sheriff Jim's patrol car was parked behind it, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The air was electric with tension, but there was a sense of purpose in the group gathered there. Everyone was ready to fight. Everyone's here, Roy said as Maggie stepped out of her truck. His eyes were hard, focused, but there was something else there too, something softer. You're sure about this? Maggie nodded, locking eyes with him. I'm sure. They're moving, Roy. We need to find out what they're hiding, and we need to do it now. Sheriff Jim stepped forward, his voice steady but with an edge of concern. We'll take it slow. We don't know what they've got planned, and I'm not taking any chances. We'll split into two groups. One will take the main road, and the other will flank through the woods. We need to catch them off guard. Maggie's heart raced, but she steadied herself. She had been in situations like this before, dangerous, unpredictable. But this time, it was different. This time, she was leading. The plan was set. Maggie's group would take the road, while Roy and Sheriff Jim's group would circle around through the woods. They had one goal: find out where Jax and his crew were heading and what they were up to. They moved quickly, quietly, each of them knowing the stakes. Maggie felt the weight of the responsibility settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had trusted her, everyone who was counting on her to keep them safe. As they drove toward the east, the roads grew darker, the woods on either side of them pressing in. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the tires on the gravel. Maggie's mind raced as she scanned the road ahead. She knew they were getting close. She could feel it. Then, ahead in the distance, the faint glow of headlights pierced the darkness. "Eyes on the road," Maggie whispered into the radio. "They're up ahead." The others responded in a murmur of confirmation, and the convoy slowed, moving into position. Maggie's grip tightened on the wheel as she watched the headlights grow larger. Whoever was coming, they were close. And then, they saw it. A convoy of vehicles, 4, maybe 5, trundling down the road, moving slow, deliberate. The lead vehicle was a black SUV, followed by a couple of large trucks. Maggie recognized the familiar shape of Jax's crew in the second truck. It was unmistakable, the rough, menacing aura that radiated from them even in the dead of night. Maggie's stomach turned. This wasn't just a supply run. They were hauling something, and they weren't just passing through. They were moving something important. She glanced over at Roy, who was watching the convoy through the side mirror. His face was set in stone, his eyes cold. There was no doubt about it. They were about to find out exactly what Jax and his crew were up to. Maggie keyed her microphone. "We move now. Stay in position and stay quiet. We're not engaging unless we have to." As they followed the convoy, Maggie's mind kept racing. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping up her spine. They were getting closer to whatever Jax was hiding. The tension in the air felt thicker with each passing minute, and Maggie knew that the moment of truth was drawing near. Suddenly, the convoy took a sharp turn onto a dirt road, heading into the woods. Maggie's eyes widened. The road led to the old quarry, an abandoned site on the outskirts of town, long since forgotten by the locals. It was the perfect place to hide something, a place where no one would dare go. "We follow them," Maggie said, her voice steady. "Don't lose sight of them." The convoy rumbled through the trees, kicking up dust and gravel as they drove deeper into the woods. Maggie's group followed at a safe distance, their headlights off to remain unseen. The air was thick with anticipation, and Maggie could feel her heartbeat in her throat. As they neared the quarry, they saw the convoy come to a stop near a cluster of old, rusted shipping containers. The vehicles parked in a semicircle around them, and Maggie's eyes narrowed. Whatever was inside those containers, it was important. It was hidden, and it was the key to understanding what Jax and his crew were really up to. She motioned for the group to stop. They would have to move in on foot now. Quietly, they crept through the underbrush, staying low and out of sight. The sounds of the convoy's engines slowly faded as they approached the quarry. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as they crept closer to the shipping containers. The faint glow of light filtered out through the cracks, casting long shadows on the ground. She could hear voices now, muffled, speaking in low tones. "We get in position," Maggie whispered. "We need to know what's inside those containers." As the group took their places, Maggie's thoughts ran wild. The boxes, the white van. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Jax wasn't just running a gang. He was part of something larger, something far more dangerous. She was about to find out just how deep the rabbit hole went. The air was damp and cool as Maggie and her group huddled behind the rusted metal of an abandoned shipping container. The sounds of muffled voices from the convoy grew louder as they crept closer. Every step felt like a thunderous echo in her chest, but Maggie's focus was laser-sharp. She had to stay calm, stay quiet. This was the moment that could change everything. The light from the trucks flickered against the jagged edges of the quarry as Maggie motioned for everyone to hold their position. Her eyes never left the men unloading the cargo. There was no mistaking it now. Jax and his crew were unloading something significant. Whatever it was, they were keeping it hidden for a reason. Maggie leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the contents being unloaded from the back of the truck. The men moved quickly but carefully, like they were handling something fragile, precious. The tall, broad-shouldered figure of Jax stood at the front, barking orders, his sharp eyes scanning the surrounding area. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the night as one of the metal containers fell from the truck, slamming against the ground. Maggie froze, her heart racing. She had to be careful. They couldn't afford to be discovered now. Slowly, she lowered herself further into the shadows, trying to make herself as small as possible. She strained her ears, listening intently as Jax's voice rang out again. "Get that last one off. Move it," he yelled, his tone heavy with impatience. "We don't have time. The shipment needs to be here before dawn." "Got it, boss," one of his men responded, his voice low and steady. Maggie's pulse quickened. Shipment. That was the key word. This was no random collection of stolen goods. They were moving something that was being shipped, something important enough that Jax was racing against time to get it to its destination. Her instincts screamed at her to get closer, to figure out exactly what they were dealing with. Maggie motioned for Roy and the others to follow her as quietly as possible. They slunk from their positions, carefully creeping through the shadows toward the edge of the quarry. They couldn't let Jax and his crew know they were there. The stakes were too high. As they moved closer, Maggie could make out the outlines of several large wooden crates stacked inside the container. One of them was partially open, and she could see the glint of metal inside, something unfamiliar. Her stomach twisted in apprehension. She had to know what was inside. With her heart pounding, Maggie took a deep breath and reached for her phone, quietly snapping a few pictures of the crates. She zoomed in, focusing on the markings on the side of one of the crates. They were in a language she didn't recognize, something foreign, and there was a stamp in bold letters, "Property of Titan Logistics." She felt a chill run down her spine. Titan Logistics? She had never heard of it, but the name sounded official, corporate even. This wasn't just a gang operation. It was connected to something bigger, something far beyond the scope of anything Willow Creek had ever faced. "Did you see that?" Roy whispered from behind her. "Titan Logistics. That sounds like a real company." Maggie nodded, her eyes still locked on the crate. "Whatever's in these containers is important. It's not just illegal drugs or stolen goods. This is something bigger." Suddenly, one of the men turned and looked in their direction. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. The shadows weren't enough to hide them anymore. Without thinking, she grabbed Roy's arm and pulled him back, motioning for everyone to retreat. They needed to get out of sight, fast. They scrambled back behind a pile of rubble, hearts pounding in their chests. The man hadn't seen them, but he was getting too close for comfort. "Now what?" Roy hissed under his breath. "They know we're here?" "Not yet," Maggie replied, trying to steady her breathing. "We just need to figure out what they're doing with these crates. We get that information back to Sheriff Jim, and we can shut them down before they make their next move." Roy nodded, his jaw clenched. "But we can't let them slip away. We're too close to finding out what this is all about." The tension was unbearable. Maggie's mind raced with questions. Titan Logistics. What kind of company was that? Who were they working with? And why was Jax so desperate to move this shipment in the dead of night? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle starting. One of the trucks was revving its engine, preparing to leave. Maggie's heart raced again. They couldn't let them get away. Not now. Not when they were so close to discovering the truth. "We have to move," Maggie whispered urgently. "We can't let them get away. Let's follow them." Roy nodded, and they moved quickly, trying to stay out of sight as the convoy began to pull away from the quarry. The trucks rumbled down the dirt road, and Maggie's heart was in her throat. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever they were transporting, they had to know where it was going. Maggie's truck was parked a little ways off, and she signaled for everyone to get in quickly. The convoy was still far enough ahead that they wouldn't notice them, but time was running out. They had to stay close. Maggie gunned the engine and followed, keeping a safe distance behind the trucks. The road wound through the dense forest, the headlights of the convoy lighting the way. They were heading out of town, deeper into unfamiliar territory. Maggie had no idea where they were going, but she was determined to find out. As they followed, the landscape began to change. The trees thinned, and the road widened. The trucks turned off the main path and onto a smaller, unmarked dirt road that led toward a secluded area. "Where the hell are they going?" Roy muttered from the passenger seat. I don't know, Maggie replied, her voice tight. But we're about to find out. The convoy finally came to a stop at the base of a large, nondescript building. It was a warehouse of some sort, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years, old, crumbling, and covered in vines. Maggie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was no ordinary storage facility. This place was meant to keep things hidden. The trucks pulled into the building's garage, and the men began unloading the crates once more. Maggie parked her truck a safe distance away, staying out of sight, and quickly got out. This is it, Maggie said, her voice low. We've got them. But as they watched the men move swiftly and efficiently into the warehouse, Maggie realized something else. This wasn't just a smuggling operation. This was organized. This was methodical. Jax wasn't just running a gang. He was part of something bigger. And now, Maggie knew she had to expose it all. But the question remained. What were they hiding in those crates? The cold wind rustled through the trees as Maggie, Roy, and the others crouched behind a row of rusted barrels just outside the warehouse. The building loomed ahead like a fortress, its weathered exterior betraying nothing of the secrets hidden within. The sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed in the distance as Jax and his crew moved the crates into the building, their movements sharp and deliberate. Stay quiet, Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible as she peered through the dark shadows. We need to know what's inside those crates. Roy nodded, his face set in grim determination. We're getting close, Maggie. I can feel it. But we can't be reckless. We need to get in there, find the answers, and get out. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She had spent her entire life fighting for her town, her people, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she wasn't just fighting for Willow Creek. She was fighting to uncover a truth that could shake everything she knew to its core. Agreed, Maggie said, her voice steady, but we can't leave here empty-handed. This time, we bring the truth back with us. The group moved as one, slipping through the shadows toward the back of the warehouse. The men unloading the crates had moved inside, leaving the area eerily quiet. Maggie felt the weight of every step, each one bringing them closer to the unknown. She reached the back door of the warehouse and motioned for Roy to check the handle. It was locked, of course, but that wasn't going to stop her. Maggie had been in tight situations before, and she wasn't going to let a locked door hold her back. Roy nodded to her, understanding the unspoken plan. He pulled a small set of tools from his bag and knelt by the door. Maggie kept watch, her eyes scanning the surrounding area, making sure they weren't caught off guard. The sound of the lock clicking open was almost too quiet to hear, but Maggie was sharp, and she moved quickly as the door creaked open. They slipped inside, careful to make no sound. The air inside the warehouse was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and metal. Maggie could see rows of crates stacked high against the walls, each one covered in dust. But it was the crates closest to the center of the room that caught her attention. Over there, she whispered, pointing toward a set of crates that looked newer, fresher, marked with the same unusual symbols she had seen earlier on the boxes Jax's crew had unloaded at the quarry. These crates were different. They weren't just for storage. Whatever was inside, it was important, and it was being hidden for a reason. Maggie motioned for Roy and the others to follow her as they moved cautiously toward the crates. The rest of the warehouse was still, but she could hear muffled voices in the distance, deeper within the building. Jax and his men were still inside. They reached the crates, and Maggie hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing the cool metal surface. There was a faint hum coming from within the boxes, a sound that seemed almost mechanical. Her pulse quickened. "Do you hear that?" Roy whispered. Maggie nodded, her mind racing. "It's like they're alive. Or maybe they're just powered somehow." "Let's open one," Roy said, his voice low and determined. "We need to know what we're dealing with." Maggie nodded again, and they worked together to pry open the nearest crate. It wasn't easy. The wood was thick, and the nails had been hammered in hard, but eventually, they managed to crack it open. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as the lid came off. Inside was something she hadn't expected. A large, dark metal box covered in strange markings. The box was sealed tight, but there were wires and ports on the sides that made it clear this wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was a piece of technology. and it was something beyond anything Maggie had ever seen. "What the hell is this?" Roy muttered, staring at the strange device in front of them. Maggie swallowed, her mind racing. "I don't know. But this could explain everything." Before she could say more, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. They were running out of time. "We need to go," Maggie whispered urgently. "Now." Roy hesitated for a moment, but his eyes met hers, and he nodded. The group quickly retreated, slipping out of the warehouse the same way they had come in. Maggie's mind was spinning. Whatever Jax and his crew were involved in, it was far bigger than she had imagined. This wasn't just a criminal gang. This was an operation on a scale that could change everything. They moved quickly through the shadows, heading back toward their vehicles. Maggie felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure. They were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. As they reached their vehicles, Maggie paused, her eyes scanning the night. They had what they needed. The crates, the strange technology, Jax and his crew were part of something much bigger, something that involved powerful players. And Maggie wasn't going to stop until she exposed it all. She pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a quick message to Sheriff Jim. "We have a lead. Jax is working with someone big. Meet me at the diner. We need to talk." The message sent, Maggie took a deep breath and looked at Roy. "Let's get back to town," she said. "We have work to do." But as they drove back toward Willow Creek, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling lingered. No matter how big or small, the shadows seemed to be closing in around them. And whatever Jax and his crew were hiding, Maggie knew that they weren't the only ones interested in it. The headlights of Maggie's truck cut through the fog as they made their way back to Willow Creek. The town seemed oddly peaceful, like nothing could disrupt its quiet existence. But Maggie knew better. After what they had uncovered in the warehouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. As they turned onto Main Street, the familiar glow of the diner came into view. It was an old, cozy place, a staple of the town where locals gathered for breakfast, gossip, and a hot cup of coffee. Tonight, however, the diner was a place of strategy, a place where they'd lay out everything they'd learned and try to make sense of it all. Maggie pulled into the parking lot and parked near the door. Roy followed closely behind, and the two of them got out of the truck, making their way toward the diner's entrance. Inside, Sheriff Jim was already waiting, sitting at a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of him. His face was drawn, his expression serious as he looked up when they entered. He didn't waste any time. "Tell me everything," Jim said, his voice low but steady. Maggie slid into the booth across from him, Roy following her lead. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. She had never expected anything like this to happen in her town, let alone become part of it. But she knew that it was up to her to stop whatever was brewing. "Jim, it's bigger than we thought," Maggie said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "Jax and his crew, they're not just running a local operation. They're working for someone else, someone big. And the crates they're moving, it's not drugs, it's not stolen goods. It's technology, some kind of high-tech device, and I don't know what it does yet, but it's definitely not something you'd find on the black market." Jim's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward. "Titan Logistics. That's what you said, right? The markings on the crates?" Maggie nodded. "Yes, that's what they're marked with. And it doesn't sound like a company that's dealing with low-level smuggling. This is corporate-level stuff, Jim. I've never heard of Titan Logistics before, but I'm starting to think we're dealing with something far bigger than just a local gang. Whoever they are, they have the resources to keep this operation running under the radar." Roy, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Maggie's right. We need to figure out who they're working with. If Titan Logistics is behind this, then we're dealing with people who have connections. Big ones." Jim rubbed his temples, clearly processing everything. "I don't like this, but we can't move on any of it until we know more. If Titan Logistics is involved, this isn't just a local issue anymore. We're talking federal territory." Maggie shook her head. "I don't care who's involved. If Jax and his crew are working for them, it's still happening in our town, and it's up to us to stop it before it gets worse." Jim didn't respond immediately, his gaze steady as he stared at Maggie. She could see the weight of the situation settling on him, but she also saw something else, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew they were on the right track. "All right," Jim said, finally breaking the silence. "I'll make a few calls, see if I can find anything about Titan Logistics. We can't risk tipping them off, though. I'll keep it low profile." Maggie nodded. "That's all we can do right now. But we have to be careful. Whoever's behind this won't hesitate to cover their tracks, and we're getting closer to something big. We need to move fast before they realize we're onto them." Jim gave a grim nod, and then there was a long silence as they all took a moment to absorb the magnitude of the situation. The peaceful, small-town life that Willow Creek had always known was slipping away, and in its place, there was an underground network of operations far beyond their control. Maggie knew that this wasn't just about stopping Jax anymore. This was about stopping something that could destroy everything she had worked to protect. And the worst part was, they didn't even know the full extent of what they were up against. After a few moments, Maggie broke the silence. "We need to figure out what those crates are. If they're moving them around town, they're likely hiding them somewhere else. And it's not just about the shipment, it's about what they're doing with it." Jim looked at her sharply. "You're saying they're using Willow Creek as a storage point? A transit hub?" "Exactly," Maggie said, her voice steady with conviction. "I think they're using the town as a way to move these crates under the radar. And if that's the case, there's more of them hidden in the area. We just need to find them before they get moved again." Jim exhaled slowly, clearly weighing the options. "All right, we'll need backup, and I'm going to need you to stay in the loop. We can't act too quickly, but we also can't wait too long." Maggie's eyes locked with his, her resolve hardening. "I don't care what it takes, Jim. We have to stop them." Roy, who had been quiet for a moment, added, "We need to be prepared for anything. Whoever's behind this won't go down without a fight." Maggie nodded. She was right. They had already seen the lengths Jax and his crew would go to protect their operation. If they were going to expose the truth, they needed to be ready for whatever came next. As the conversation continued, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The pieces were falling into place, but the bigger picture was still shrouded in mystery. What was Titan Logistics really up to? What was inside those crates? And how far were they willing to go to protect their secret? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of the diner's door opening. The bell above the door jingled as a man in a black hoodie stepped inside. Maggie's eyes narrowed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with purpose. He scanned the room for a moment before his gaze settled on their booth. "Jim," the man said with a cold, measured voice, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. "We need to talk." The man in the black hoodie stepped into the diner with an air of quiet authority. Maggie instinctively tensed, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. His presence seemed out of place in the otherwise familiar setting. The small-town diner was a haven for regulars, not for people who carried the weight of secrets. Sheriff Jim's expression didn't change as the man approached, though his posture stiffened slightly. "What do you want?" Jim asked, his voice calm but guarded. The man gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, then slid into the booth across from the sheriff. He didn't speak immediately, just looked at Jim with a cold, calculating gaze. Maggie could feel the tension building in the air. Whatever this meeting was about, it was serious. Roy, who had been sitting silently, leaned slightly forward, trying to gauge the situation. Maggie remained still, watching the stranger closely. She didn't trust him, not yet. There was something unsettling about the way he carried himself, the way his eyes seemed to scan the room, making sure no one else was listening. After a few seconds, the man spoke, his voice low and controlled. "I'm not here to make a scene, Sheriff. I need to talk to you about the people you're getting involved with." Jim raised an eyebrow, the tension in his face showing for the first time. "What people?" "The ones with the crates," the man said, his eyes flicking briefly to Maggie and Roy before returning to Jim. "I'm sure you've figured out by now that what they're moving isn't just local business. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that getting involved in something like this, something big, isn't exactly safe." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. The man knew about the crates. He knew about what they had uncovered. Jim didn't respond immediately, though Maggie could see the wheels turning in his mind. His gaze flickered briefly to Maggie, and she could see the unspoken question in his eyes. Do we trust him? The stranger must have sensed the moment of hesitation. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. Let me make it clear, Sheriff. This isn't a local operation. These people are connected, and if you're not careful, you could end up in the way. His voice dropped, becoming almost a whisper. You could end up dead. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Maggie clenched her fists under the table, trying to keep her cool. The man was clearly threatening them, but there was something else in his voice, something that hinted at urgency, not just menace. Who are you? Maggie finally asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. What's your stake in all of this? The man gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. I'm someone who knows what's coming, and I'm trying to keep people like you from getting caught in the crossfire. Roy leaned in, his eyes sharp. You're saying you're trying to help us? Or are you just here to scare us into backing off? The man didn't flinch. I'm not asking you to back off. I'm asking you to listen. If you want to keep pushing this, you need to know exactly what you're up against. The people moving these crates, they're not just criminals. They're part of a larger organization, one that has its hands in a lot more than you can imagine. They don't care about towns like Willow Creek. They care about power, control, and money. Maggie was beginning to see the bigger picture, and it sent a cold shiver down her spine. So, what's the game plan? You want us to just let them get away with it? No, the man replied quickly, his tone hardening. I want you to stop them, but not without the right information. I'm here to give you what you need to do that. Jim's eyes narrowed. Why this sudden change of heart? You've been watching us, haven't you? The man didn't flinch. I've been watching everyone, but that's not the point. You're getting involved in something that could bring a hell of a lot more trouble to your doorstep if you don't play it right. These people won't hesitate to destroy anyone in their way, no matter how small. There was a long silence. Maggie looked at Jim, trying to gauge his reaction. The sheriff's face was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his clenched jaw. This was not the kind of thing he could handle alone. All right, Jim said after a long pause. What do you know? The man finally leaned back, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The crates, those aren't just random shipments. They're part of a larger operation, and Titan Logistics is just the front. The people behind this, let's call them the syndicate, they've been running operations like this for years, across the country. They move high-value goods, things that can't be traced, things that are way above anything Willow Creek has seen before. Maggie's mind raced. So, what are they transporting? What's in the crates? The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the diner as if checking for eavesdroppers. I don't know exactly, but I've been tracking shipments like this for a while now, and I can tell you one thing for certain. Whatever's inside those crates could change the balance of power in this country. It's big, and it's dangerous. And if you're not careful, you could find yourself in way over your head. Jim was silent for a long moment, considering the implications. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resolute. So, what do we do now? The man stood up slowly, his gaze sharp as he looked at each of them in turn. You keep your eyes open. Follow the crates, find out where they're going. And when the time's right, I'll help you bring them down. But you have to move carefully. The syndicate is everywhere, and they won't hesitate to erase anyone who gets in their way. Before Maggie could respond, the man turned and walked out of the diner without another word, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had arrived. The door jingled as it closed behind him, and the tension in the room seemed to lift, but only slightly. Maggie sat back in her seat, staring at the empty booth across from them. Her mind was reeling from everything the man had said. The syndicate, power, control, money. It was all starting to make sense, but it felt more dangerous than ever. Jim exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. Looks like we've got a lot more to uncover, and it's not going to be easy. We'll be ready, Maggie said, her voice steady with resolve. We're not backing down now. Not when we're this close. The sound of Maggie's truck engine filled the quiet of the night as she, Roy, and Sheriff Jim made their way toward the outskirts of Willow Creek. Their minds were still reeling from the strange encounter with the man in the hoodie, and now they had more questions than answers. Maggie kept her eyes on the road, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. The man had dropped a bombshell on them, the syndicate. The word alone sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just a local operation. It was part of something much bigger, something far beyond Willow Creek. And if what he said was true, they were walking into dangerous territory. The tires of the truck crunched against the gravel as they approached the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. It had always been a place of mystery, a relic from the past that no one really knew much about. But now, Maggie's instincts told her this was where they needed to be. The crates they had seen earlier, the ones with the strange markings, had to be tied to this place. If they were going to uncover the truth, they needed to start here. Maggie slowed the truck as they pulled up to the empty lot in front of the warehouse. It was dark and quiet, the kind of eerie silence that only existed when something was hidden in plain sight. The flickering light from the old street lamp barely cut through the shadows, but Maggie didn't need much to see the outline of the building looming ahead. Roy leaned forward, looking out the window. "You think they're still here? After everything?" "I don't know," Maggie replied, her voice tight with uncertainty. "But I'm sure they're not just going to pack up and leave without a trace. Whatever's in those crates, it's too important. They'll be back to check on it." Jim looked at her, his expression grave. "So, what's the plan? We go in quietly, see if we can find anything useful?" Maggie nodded. "Exactly. We need to know what they're really hiding. If the syndicate is involved, then this place is probably more than just a storage warehouse. It's likely part of something much bigger." They sat in silence for a moment, each of them preparing for what was to come. Maggie's heart raced, her thoughts racing along with it. If they were going to expose this operation, they had to do it carefully. No mistakes. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not with the stakes so high. Maggie glanced at Roy, and he gave her a reassuring nod. "We've got this," he said, his voice steady. "Let's just take it slow, stay in the shadows. We'll find what we need." The three of them got out of the truck and made their way toward the warehouse, moving cautiously to avoid making any noise. The air was thick with tension, each step heavy with the weight of what they might discover. When they reached the back of the warehouse, Maggie gestured for them to stop. There was a small, barely noticeable door on the side of the building, tucked behind a stack of old pallets. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but Maggie had a feeling it would be their entry point. Roy knelt by the door, his fingers working quickly with a set of lockpicks. Maggie kept watch, her senses on high alert. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, her muscles tight with anticipation. The sound of Roy's tools clicking echoed in the stillness, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. They slipped inside, taking care to avoid making any sound that might alert anyone inside. The warehouse was dark, and the air smelled of dust and old metal. Maggie's eyes adjusted to the dim light as they moved deeper into the building. There were rows upon rows of crates, all stacked high and neatly arranged, just as they had seen earlier. But now, there was a sense of urgency in the air. Something was off. "This is it," Jim whispered, his voice low. "Let's find out what's really going on here." They moved silently through the rows of crates, their eyes scanning for anything that looked out of place. Maggie's heart was pounding in her chest, and every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. But nothing was going to stop her. Not now. They reached the center of the warehouse, where the crates with the strange markings were stacked. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she looked at the crate closest to them. This was it. This was what they had been after. Roy stepped forward and pried open the crate with a crowbar, his hands steady despite the tension. The lid creaked as it came off, revealing what lay inside. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything special, but as they dug deeper into the crate, they uncovered a set of high-tech devices, sleek, metallic objects, all interconnected with wires and glowing faintly with a blue light. Maggie's mind raced as she realized what this was. These weren't just ordinary objects. These were pieces of equipment that could change everything. Jim's voice broke the silence. "What are these?" Maggie took a step closer, examining the devices. "I don't know, but they're not anything I've ever seen before. And if these are connected to the syndicate, it means they're planning something big." The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse, and Maggie's heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. "We need to get out of here," she said urgently. "Now." Roy and Jim didn't hesitate. They quickly grabbed what they could, taking pictures of the devices and making sure they had everything they needed. But as they moved toward the exit, the sound of voices grew louder. They had to move fast. Just as they reached the back door, Maggie felt a sharp tug on her sleeve. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Jax. His expression was cold, but his eyes were filled with recognition and anger. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "And I was hoping you'd stay away long enough for this to blow over. But it looks like you're not going anywhere." Maggie's pulse raced as she faced Jax, standing there with his arms crossed and a look of cold determination in his eyes. His presence was imposing, and despite the urgency of the moment, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. Behind her, she could hear Roy and Jim shifting, both prepared for whatever Jax might throw at them. But there was no doubt, this was a critical moment. If they didn't handle this carefully, everything they'd worked for would unravel. Jax didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit like a wall. "You've been poking around in places you don't belong," he said, his voice low and threatening. "And now you're going to regret it." Maggie's mind raced. She had to think fast. She knew Jax wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have let them get this far if he didn't have a plan. But she had a plan, too. She wasn't going to back down now. "We're not leaving until we get answers, Jax," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the tension that gripped her chest. "Whatever's going on here, it's bigger than you, and we're going to stop it." Jax chuckled, a humorless sound that echoed in the empty warehouse. "You think you can stop it? You're in way over your head, Maggie. You have no idea who you're messing with. The syndicate isn't something you can just stop. It's something that's already too far gone." Maggie took a step forward, meeting his gaze. "I'm not afraid of you, Jax. We know about the crates. We know they're not just some local operation. And we're going to make sure everyone knows what's really going on here." Jax's expression darkened. He took a step toward her, closing the distance. "You think you've got it figured out, don't you? But you don't even understand what you're up against. These people, they don't just take things, they control them. And if you keep pushing, you'll be swept away in a tide you can't fight." Maggie's heart beat faster, the weight of his words sinking in. But she wasn't backing down. She couldn't. "We're not going anywhere until we get what we came for," Maggie said firmly. "We're not afraid of you, Jax. And we're not afraid of the syndicate either." Jax's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something. An uncertainty, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small earpiece and speaking into it. "I've got company coming," he said, his voice sharp. "You've got 2 minutes before things get ugly." Maggie's mind raced. He was calling in reinforcements, but they couldn't afford to wait around. She looked at Roy and Jim, both of them tense and ready for anything. "We need to get out of here now," Maggie said quietly. "We can't fight this head-on, not yet." Before they could move, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Maggie turned toward the noise, and a knot tightened in her stomach. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and 3 figures stepped inside. The dim light cast long shadows across the floor, and Maggie's heart skipped a beat. One of the figures stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a black leather jacket. The other 2 flanked him, their expressions unreadable. They were part of the syndicate, no doubt about it, and they were here to stop them. Jax smiled, his face cold. "You're not getting out of here without answering some questions first." Maggie didn't have time to think. She glanced at Roy, who was already moving, his hand gripping the small flashlight he had tucked into his belt. Jim was ready, too, his stance defensive. "We're not here to answer your questions, Jax," Maggie said, her voice hardening. "We're here to expose the truth." Before anyone could react, Roy moved, grabbing a nearby metal pipe and swinging it toward the first syndicate member. The man ducked, but Roy was fast, his strike landing with a loud clang against the man's side. The syndicate member staggered back, clearly surprised by the force. Maggie didn't wait for anything else to happen. She grabbed Jim's arm, pulling him toward the back door. "Move!" she shouted, her voice desperate. They ran, adrenaline pumping as they darted through the warehouse, heading toward the exit. The syndicate members weren't far behind. The sound of heavy footsteps and angry shouts filled the air, pushing Maggie to move faster. Her heart pounded in her chest, each breath coming in quick, sharp gasps. They reached the back door, and Maggie yanked it open, running out into the night. The cool air hit her like a wave, but she didn't stop. They had to get back to the truck. They had to get out of here before they were cornered. "Get in the truck," Maggie yelled, her eyes scanning the dark parking lot for any sign of danger. Roy and Jim were already in motion, running behind her, but the sound of footsteps growing louder behind them told her they didn't have much time. As they reached the truck, Maggie threw open the door and jumped into the driver's seat. Roy slid into the passenger seat, and Jim climbed into the back. Maggie didn't waste a second. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, the engine roaring to life as the tires screeched against the gravel. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of the syndicate members chasing them, but Maggie wasn't looking back. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, weaving through the dark streets of Willow Creek. "Where are we going?" Roy asked, his voice tense. Maggie's hands gripped the wheel, her mind focused. "We need to regroup. We need more information. We're not done yet." But even as she spoke, a sense of dread settled over her. The syndicate had just made it clear that they weren't going to let Maggie and her team walk away. And as they sped through the night, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The truck's headlights cut through the night as Maggie pushed the pedal to the metal, weaving through the darkened streets of Willow Creek. The engine roared, and the wind whipped against the windows, but there was a persistent knot in her stomach that no amount of speed could shake. Behind her, the sound of the pursuing vehicles grew fainter, but Maggie knew they couldn't outrun the syndicate forever. The stakes were too high, and they were too deep in this to back down now. She needed a plan. A solid one. Roy shifted in his seat, glancing out the side mirror. "We lost them for now, but we both know they won't stop looking for us. They know we're onto something big." Jim's voice from the back seat was grave. "We've got to stay one step ahead, but we also need answers. We need to know who's behind this syndicate and what exactly they're moving." Maggie nodded, her mind whirling. She could feel the weight of their situation bearing down on her. They were in uncharted territory, and the clock was ticking. If they didn't act fast, they could become another casualty in a game they didn't fully understand. "Let's head to the old church," Maggie said, her voice sharp with resolve. "We'll meet with someone who can help us. Someone who knows how to handle people like Jax and the syndicate." Roy raised an eyebrow. "The old church? You think it's safe there?" Maggie nodded. "It's not just a church, it's a safe house. People know the people who want to keep Willow Creek safe go there. It's out of the way, and it'll give us time to regroup. If we stay in town too long, we'll be sitting ducks. We need more intel, and I know just the person who can get it for us." Roy and Jim exchanged a look, and for a moment, Maggie wondered if they thought she was crazy for making such a bold move. But she couldn't let fear hold her back, not now. The truck's tires hummed as they sped out of the town limits, heading toward the hills that overlooked Willow Creek. The church wasn't far, nestled in the woods where no one really went unless they had a reason. As they approached the building, the lights from the truck illuminated the weathered stone walls of the church, and the old, twisted iron gates creaked in the breeze. Maggie could already feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. This place was a relic of a simpler time, but it was also a symbol of resilience. The kind of resilience she needed now. When they parked the truck in the shadows behind the church, Maggie got out quickly, making sure no one was watching. "Stay close," she whispered to Roy and Jim. "We don't know who's here, and we don't want to give away our position." They moved in silence, slipping through the back entrance of the church, which had been left ajar. Inside, the air was cool and still, the only sound the faint echo of their footsteps on the wooden floor. Maggie's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she led the way toward the basement, a place she'd visited before, back when things were quieter. At the bottom of the stairs, an old, weathered door creaked open, revealing a small room filled with maps, papers, and an assortment of high-tech equipment. In the corner of the room sat a man, hunched over a desk, his fingers flying over a keyboard. His name was Ellis. He was a former hacker who had once worked with law enforcement and underground groups to track down dangerous organizations like the Syndicate. Maggie had known him for years, and though his methods were unorthodox, he always got results. Ellis looked up as they entered, his face lighting up with recognition. "Maggie," he said with a grin, "I was wondering when you'd show up. I knew you wouldn't stay out of trouble for long." "Always a pleasure, Ellis," Maggie replied, her tone dry. "But this time, it's not a visit for fun. We need your help. We've got a serious problem, and it's bigger than anything Willow Creek's ever seen." Ellis' grin faded as he straightened in his chair. "The syndicate?" Maggie nodded. "They're here. They've got crates of something, high-tech, dangerous. We don't know exactly what it is, but we know it's part of something much bigger, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Ellis' eyes narrowed. "You're in deep then. I figured you were tracking something. But this," he shook his head, "you're not dealing with just local criminals. The syndicate's reach goes far beyond Willow Creek. They're an organized crime group with connections all over the country, maybe even internationally." Maggie crossed her arms, her voice hardening. "That's why we need your help. We can't do this alone. We need intel, anything that can give us an edge." Ellis thought for a moment, then stood up from his desk. He moved to a file cabinet in the corner and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been keeping tabs on them for years. Here's what I've got." He handed her the folder, and Maggie opened it quickly. Inside were photos, maps, and detailed information about the syndicate's operations. The more Maggie read, the more her stomach turned. The syndicate wasn't just a small-time operation. They were involved in everything from drug trafficking to weapons deals, and their network stretched across several states. They had their hands in everything, and they weren't afraid to eliminate anyone who got in their way. "Everything in here," Ellis continued, "points to one central figure, a man known as the Architect. No one knows his real name, but he's the one who orchestrates everything. He's the mastermind behind the syndicate." Maggie stared at the papers, a sense of dread settling over her. "So, what do we do now?" Ellis leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You need to take down the Architect. If you can get to him, you'll be able to stop everything. But it won't be easy. The syndicate has eyes everywhere. You need to be smart. Move in silence, gather more intel, and make sure you're always one step ahead." Maggie nodded, her mind already racing with the possibilities. They were in deeper than ever, but Ellis was right. They had to take down the Architect if they had any hope of stopping the syndicate. "We'll do whatever it takes," Maggie said firmly. "Thank you, Ellis." Ellis nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just make sure you don't get yourself killed." As Maggie, Roy, and Jim turned to leave, Ellis called out to them. "And Maggie?" She paused, looking back. "Watch your back. The syndicate isn't going to let you walk away from this. Not now." The air outside the church was cold and heavy, thick with the weight of what lay ahead. As Maggie, Roy, and Jim made their way back to the truck, the reality of their situation hit her harder than before. They weren't just fighting a local gang or a few bad players. They were up against an organized crime syndicate with ties to everything. If they were going to stop the syndicate and the man pulling its strings, the Architect, they needed to be more than just clever. They needed to be ruthless. Roy broke the silence as they climbed into the truck. "So, what's the plan now? We know who we're after, but how do we get to him?" Maggie started the engine, her thoughts racing. Ellis said the Architect pulls the strings from behind the scenes. He's untouchable, but not invincible. We need to find a way to get to him. Jim's voice was low, almost a growl. "It's gonna be dangerous, but we can't let them win. We've already seen what they're capable of." Maggie nodded, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. "We need to hit them where it hurts. We can't let them control everything in this town. This has to stop." She wasn't sure what made her decision for her. Maybe it was the sheer anger of the situation, or the fear of how deep this went. But in that moment, she knew the path forward wasn't just about finding the Architect. It was about making sure Willow Creek was safe again. "I'm going to make some calls," Maggie said, her tone firm. "We need allies. People who know how to handle the heat. We've got the resources, but we need to move fast. There's no time to waste." Roy and Jim exchanged a look, and Jim spoke up. "I know someone who can help. A contact from my past who's got a reputation for pulling people out of tight spots. We may not like him, but he's good at what he does." Maggie glanced at him in the rearview mirror. You're talking about Johnny, aren't you? Jim nodded. Yeah, Johnny Devereux. He's got connections with people who know how to deal with this kind of thing. If we want to go after the syndicate, we need someone who can get us the intel and get us out alive if things go south. Maggie took a deep breath, her grip tightening around the wheel. All right, let's go see Johnny. The road to Johnny Devereux's place wasn't a long one, but the drive was tense. The truck rumbled through the winding roads outside town, past the outskirts and into a quieter, less developed area. The houses were few and far between, and the ones that dotted the landscape were run down, barely standing. Johnny's place was no exception. When they pulled up to a dilapidated cabin tucked in the woods, it seemed like the last place anyone would want to be. But Maggie knew better than to judge by appearances. Johnny had always kept to himself, but when he had a job, he did it right. The door to the cabin opened before Maggie could even knock. Standing in the doorway was a man with sharp eyes, a weathered face, and the air of someone who'd seen more than his fair share of battles. Johnny was a former operative, someone who could get things done without asking too many questions, and that's exactly why Maggie needed him. "You're late," Johnny said, his voice rough from years of smoking and talking tough. "What brings you back here, Maggie?" Maggie pushed past him and into the cabin. "I need help, Johnny. We're going after the syndicate, and we need to get to the architect." Johnny raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "The syndicate? I thought you weren't the type to dive into that kind of mess." "I'm not," Maggie replied, "but now it's personal. Willow Creek's at stake, and I'm not backing down." Johnny leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "You want my help? You're going to owe me, and it's not going to be cheap." Maggie met his gaze, her voice steady. "What's it going to take?" Johnny's lips twitched into a grin. "I need you to help me take down one of their people. Someone high up, someone who has the info we need. In return, I'll give you everything you need to get to the architect. But after that, you're on your own." Maggie didn't hesitate. "Deal." Johnny motioned toward the old map on the wall, his finger tapping a specific location. "There's a drop-off point near here. I've been tracking one of their couriers for a while. He's got a package that's going to be picked up. If we can intercept him, we'll get the kind of intel that could lead us straight to the architect." Jim spoke up, his voice steady. "Where do we start?" Johnny grinned. "Right now, we lay low. Wait for the courier to show up. We don't want to make a move until we're sure he's the one." As the team settled in, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. The syndicate was a well-oiled machine, and now they were making themselves a target. It felt like every move they made brought them closer to something darker, closer to the heart of the syndicate, and closer to a confrontation with the one person who could destroy everything. Hours later, the night air was heavy with anticipation. The group had set up near the drop-off location, an old, abandoned gas station off the main road. Maggie's eyes were locked on the shadows, her heart racing. She could feel the tension in the air, the kind that only came when something important was about to happen. Jim and Roy were positioned at the ready, while Johnny kept a lookout from his spot across the street. Maggie's nerves were on edge. This was it, the moment that could change everything. If they could catch the courier, they'd have the leverage they needed to get to the architect. The sound of an engine approaching broke the silence. The headlights of a car pierced the darkness, and Maggie's pulse quickened. This was their target. "Get ready," Johnny's voice crackled through the earpiece. "This is our shot." Maggie and the team moved into position, each of them taking their place behind the dilapidated buildings. The car rolled to a stop just outside the gas station, and the courier stepped out, carrying a briefcase in his hand. Maggie held her breath as the man looked around, seemingly unaware of the trap that was about to unfold. "Now," Johnny's voice said in her ear. The air around Maggie seemed to thicken as the courier stepped out of his car, the briefcase in his hand a symbol of the secretive operations that the syndicate ran in the shadows. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, echoing through the quiet night. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how close they were to gaining the upper hand. She could feel the weight of the moment, the tension thickening in the space between them and the man who could lead them straight to the architect. Through the earpiece, Johnny's voice was low and calm. "Wait for my signal." Maggie's fingers flexed around the cold metal of her gun, her breath steady despite the rising adrenaline. She could hear the soft rustle of movement as Roy and Jim got into position, flanking the gas station from the back. They were ready. She was ready. Seconds felt like hours. The courier continued his approach, his eyes scanning the area in a habitual motion that suggested he had made this stop many times before. Maggie knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. One wrong move, and this whole plan would crumble. Finally, Johnny's voice came through the earpiece again, sharp and commanding. Now. Maggie moved in an instant. She dashed forward, her feet pounding the cracked pavement beneath her as she sprinted toward the courier. At the same time, Roy and Jim rushed in from the opposite sides, cutting off any escape routes. The courier's eyes widened with surprise, but it was too late. The three of them surrounded him in an unspoken trap. "Maggie," the courier stammered, his grip tightening on the briefcase as if it were a lifeline. "What do you want from me?" Maggie didn't waste time. She stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "You're going to tell us everything you know about the syndicate, about the shipments, about the architect. We want the truth." For a moment, the courier hesitated, his eyes darting between them as if calculating his odds of escape. But with nowhere to go, he seemed to come to a grim realization that resistance wouldn't help him. "Do you know who you're messing with?" he spat, his voice filled with defiance. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a sign that he understood the situation all too well. "If you think you can just walk away from this?" Maggie stepped closer, her gaze unyielding. "You don't have a choice." Roy and Jim flanked him, their presence closing in on him like a cage. The courier's bravado melted away, and he slowly lowered his head, giving in. "All right," he muttered. "I'll talk. But you've got to promise me that I'll make it out of here alive. The architect, he's got people everywhere. You won't be able to take him down without suffering the consequences." Maggie's heart raced as she leaned in. "Tell us what we need to know." The courier exhaled slowly, as though he was mentally preparing himself for the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "The shipments, what you've been tracking, their weapons, high-tech stuff that's going into major cities. The syndicate selling to the highest bidder, from government agencies to rogue groups. It's not just illegal guns or drugs. This is military-grade tech. And the architect? He's the one pulling the strings. He's got connections at the highest levels. No one can touch him." Maggie's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The weapons, the crates, they weren't just part of some low-level smuggling operation. This was a much bigger, more dangerous game. "Where is the architect?" she demanded. The courier looked around nervously, his eyes darting between Maggie and the others. "You think I know that? I only deal with the small stuff, the drop-offs. But I know the architect's reach is everywhere. He's got a hideout. A place in the city where he stays hidden. People come and go, but no one ever sees him. He's like a ghost." Maggie's mind was working quickly, processing every word. "Where exactly?" The courier hesitated, his eyes filled with fear. "I don't know the exact location, but I know a guy who might. He's a contact I use for the higher-ups. His name's Frank. He's the one who coordinates the bigger operations. If you can get to him, you'll get to the architect." Maggie's pulse quickened. Frank could be the key to everything. The key to taking down the syndicate once and for all. "Where do we find Frank?" she asked, her voice sharp. "He's got a safe house just outside of the city, near the old warehouse district," the courier said, his voice shaky now. "That's where he's been laying low. If you want to find him, that's where you should start." Maggie nodded, her mind already calculating the next steps. This was it. They were so close. "Thank you," she said, her voice cold. "You've done your part. Now get out of here. If I hear you've gone to the syndicate with any of this information, I'll make sure they find you first." The courier nodded quickly, looking more than eager to get away from them. He turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows without a second glance. Maggie watched him go, her heart still pounding with the adrenaline of the interception. They had the information they needed. Now, they had to act fast. "We're going after Frank," she said, her voice steady but full of resolve. "The syndicate's hiding in plain sight, and Frank is the key to getting to the architect." Roy and Jim exchanged a look, their faces hardening with determination. "Let's move," Roy said. The team climbed back into the truck and headed toward the warehouse district, the engine roaring to life as they sped down the road. The night felt darker now, the weight of their mission settling over them. They were close, too close to back out now. The truck rumbled through the quiet streets of the warehouse district, its headlights cutting through the dense fog that had begun to roll in. The towering, abandoned buildings loomed like silent sentinels, the perfect place for someone who wanted to remain unseen. Maggie's heart raced, but her mind was focused. Every move they made had led them here. This was the moment when everything would come to a head. Either they'd get the information they needed, or they'd walk right into a trap. "This place is crawling with danger," Roy muttered, his eyes scanning the darkened windows of the nearby warehouses. "You sure Frank is here?" Maggie didn't answer immediately. She was thinking back to the courier's words. Frank was the linchpin, the person who could lead them straight to the architect. But Maggie knew all too well that every step closer to the heart of the syndicate meant the stakes were higher. If Frank was as connected as the courier had suggested, then they had to be prepared for anything. "We'll find out soon enough," she finally said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Keep your eyes open. We don't know how many people Frank's got with him." Jim shifted in the back seat. "We move fast. In and out. No mistakes." Maggie nodded in agreement. They had come too far to hesitate now. They parked the truck a few blocks away, not wanting to draw attention. The fog swallowed them up as they crept toward the old warehouse. The faintest sound of footsteps echoed from behind one of the nearby buildings, but when they turned to check, it was only a stray cat darting into the shadows. "Stay close," Maggie whispered, motioning for Roy and Jim to follow her as they approached the warehouse. The building looked abandoned, but she knew better. The syndicate didn't leave their operations to chance, and they didn't make mistakes. As they reached the door, Maggie paused. The dim light from the street barely illuminated the entrance, but she could make out the faint outline of a security camera above them. She motioned for Jim to take it out. Without a sound, Jim pulled a small device from his bag and jammed the signal. The camera's light blinked out, leaving them in relative darkness. "Good," Maggie whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's move." They pushed open the door carefully. Inside, the warehouse was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust and the smell of mold. The walls were lined with crates, and the ground was littered with discarded boxes. It looked like just another abandoned building, but Maggie knew better. She could feel the tension in the air, the kind that only came when something important was about to happen. As they crept deeper into the building, they finally heard it. Voices, muffled and low, coming from the back. Maggie motioned for Roy and Jim to stay quiet. Slowly, they moved toward the sound, their footsteps careful and deliberate. Around a corner, they found it. Frank. He was standing with two men, both armed. The warehouse was dimly lit, but Maggie could see the faint glow of the overhead lights reflecting off Frank's face. He was lean, with sharp features and a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He wasn't surprised to see them, but there was a flicker of recognition when he spotted Maggie. Well, Frank said with a smirk, his voice low and smooth. "I wondered how long it would take before you came knocking." Maggie didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her voice firm. "We're not here to play games, Frank. We want the architect." Frank's smirk didn't falter, but the tension in the air grew thicker. "You think I'm going to just give up my boss just like that? You've got no idea what you're getting yourselves into." Maggie's hand tightened on her gun, but she didn't draw it. "Not yet. You're going to tell us what we need to know, Frank. We know you're connected, and if you don't, we'll make sure you regret it." Frank's eyes flickered to the two men beside him. "You think you're in control here? You're standing in my turf now. I'm the one who decides what happens next." Before Maggie could react, one of Frank's men reached for his gun. The sound of it clicking into place sent a surge of adrenaline through her. In an instant, everything turned chaotic. The man with the gun took a step toward them, but Roy was faster. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man's arm, twisting it and slamming him to the ground with a thud. Jim lunged at the other, disarming him with swift precision, pushing him back against the wall. Frank's face twisted in rage. "You think you can take me down? You're dead wrong." Maggie didn't flinch. "Tell me where the architect is." Frank's expression darkened, But just as quickly as the anger appeared, it faded, replaced by a calculating look. He slowly raised his hands, showing that he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "You're not going to like this, Maggie. But the architect doesn't work like that. You can't just show up and expect him to hand over everything. If you want him, you're going to have to do more than just throw a few punches." Maggie's patience was wearing thin. She took a step closer, her voice cold. "Then tell me what I need to do, Frank, because I'm done with games." Frank leaned in, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "You want to find him? You'll need to go underground. The architect has a network of safe houses, places that even I don't know about. But there's one person who can lead you to him. His name is Elias. He's been working with the architect for years. You can find him at the old docks, near the abandoned pier. That's where he's been laying low." Maggie's mind whirred with the new information. Elias, the one person who could bring them face to face with the architect. She knew this was their shot. Everything they had worked for had led them here. "Good," Maggie said, her voice steady. "We're done here." Roy and Jim kept their eyes on Frank's men as they backed away, hands raised in surrender. Frank didn't make a move to stop them. He knew better. As they exited the warehouse, Maggie's thoughts were already racing ahead. The docks, Elias, and the architect. This was it, the final step. The docks were just as bleak and unforgiving as Maggie had imagined. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and rust, and the dim lights from the old street lamps barely cut through the fog that clung to the edges of the pier. The warehouses loomed like ghosts, their empty windows staring out across the dark water. It was a place where the forgotten things came to die, and Maggie had the distinct feeling that whatever happened next would change everything. As they approached the old pier, Jim's voice came over the comms. "We're close. Elias is supposed to be here. Stay sharp." Maggie nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun, though she hoped she wouldn't need it. The atmosphere felt heavier here, dangerous, as if every step they took brought them closer to something they couldn't yet see. They had no idea what Elias would be like, or if he was even still here, but they had no choice. He was their last lead. They moved quietly, sticking to the shadows, as they made their way to the dilapidated building at the far end of the pier. The door creaked ominously as Maggie pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was stale, and the only sound was the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. At the far side of the room, a man sat at a rickety wooden table, his back to them. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a look of someone who hadn't slept in days. His face was partially hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. "Elias," Maggie called out, her voice steady but filled with urgency. The man didn't move at first, then slowly turned his head, his cold eyes locking onto Maggie's. There was something calculating in his gaze, something that told her he'd seen it all, and that he wasn't afraid of anything. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Elias said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been expecting you." Maggie didn't flinch. "You know why we're here." He leaned back in his chair, studying them carefully. "Yeah, I do. You want the architect. We know you can lead us to him," Maggie pressed. "We're not here to waste time. You tell us what we need to know, or we walk. It's that simple." Elias chuckled, though it wasn't a warm sound. "You think it's that easy? The architect doesn't just let anyone walk up to him. He's untouchable, you understand? He's got eyes everywhere." Maggie's jaw tightened. "I don't care. I've come too far to turn back now. Tell us where he is, and we'll handle the rest." Elias studied her for a long moment before sighing. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that. But you're not wrong. The architect, he's been planning this for years. His operations are spread out, and he's got a system in place. You can't just walk in and take him down without a plan." Maggie stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "Then tell me how to find him. We'll make our own plan." Elias seemed to weigh his options. Finally, he spoke, his tone quieter now. "There's a meeting place. A place where the architect deals with his high-ranking people. It's a place he trusts. It's hidden, but not impenetrable." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" Elias' eyes flickered to the door. "Not here. I can't talk about it like this. Too many ears. There's a location, a warehouse outside the city. The syndicate's headquarters. That's where you'll find him. But you have to be careful. It's a trap. They'll know you're coming. Maggie nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. This was the break they needed. The final showdown with the architect was within reach. How do we get in? Roy asked, stepping forward, his voice low but intense. Elias eyed them warily before standing up, pushing his chair back. I can't tell you everything, but I can give you a key. There's a hidden entrance, an old service tunnel that leads directly into the building. It's not easy to find, but if you can get in, you'll be able to bypass most of the guards. Maggie felt a surge of hope. This was it, the last piece of the puzzle. Where is it? Elias walked over to a nearby wall and pressed a hidden switch. A panel slid open, revealing a small metal box. He opened it and pulled out a key card, handing it to Maggie. Use this at the side entrance of the warehouse. It'll get you through. But be careful. Once you're in, you're on your own. The rest is up to you. Maggie took the key card, her fingers brushing against Elias' hand. Thanks, she said quietly, her mind already on the next move. They had a way in. Now they just had to make sure they didn't end up as collateral damage. You don't know what you're getting into, Elias said, his voice almost a whisper. The architect doesn't lose. Not to people like you. Maggie's gaze hardened. We'll see about that. With that, the team turned and left the room, their footsteps quick and purposeful as they retraced their steps back to the truck. The plan was simple. Get to the warehouse, find the hidden entrance, and take down the architect. But Maggie knew better than to assume anything would be easy. The closer they got to their target, the more danger they'd face. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. The truck sped through the darkened streets, the cold night air rushing past as Maggie's mind raced. They were close. Too close. The syndicate had controlled everything in Willow Creek for far too long. The architect had woven his web, and now it was time to tear it all down. Maggie clenched the steering wheel. This would be the final battle. They either walked out of that warehouse with victory or didn't walk out at all. They had no other choice. The night had grown unbearably still as Maggie, Roy, and Jim stood in front of the abandoned warehouse. The keycard Elias had given them felt heavy in Maggie's pocket, each step closer to the entrance sending a ripple of anticipation through her. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. But even with the adrenaline pumping through her veins, a quiet voice in the back of her mind reminded her that this was more than just a mission. It was personal. The architect had destroyed lives. His reach was vast, his power nearly untouchable. But Maggie wasn't afraid. She had seen the worst the world had to offer, and now she was ready to face it head-on. The fog had thickened as they approached the side of the warehouse, the shadows swallowing them whole. It was the dead of night, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city. Everything felt like it was building toward an inevitable clash. Jim looked at the door where the hidden entrance awaited them. This is it, he muttered, his voice grim but resolute. Maggie nodded, her hand already reaching for the keycard. Once we go in, we stick together. We get in, we find the architect, and we finish this. Roy's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the darkened surroundings. Stay sharp. There's no way he won't have people inside, waiting for us. The door slid open with a low, mechanical groan. The sound felt deafening in the silence. Maggie took a deep breath and stepped inside, followed by Roy and Jim. The warehouse was massive, the walls lined with old crates and industrial equipment. The dim lighting barely illuminated their path, but Maggie's instincts were razor-sharp. She felt the weight of the moment, knowing every decision from here on out could mean life or death. They moved quietly through the space, their footsteps barely audible over the hum of the machinery. The keycard opened another set of doors, revealing a long corridor that led deep into the heart of the building. It's just up ahead, Maggie whispered. The adrenaline was starting to settle in, and her focus was absolute. They came to a stop at a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. It was unguarded, no armed sentries, no alarms. The architect wanted them to find him. This was the final test. Maggie motioned for Roy and Jim to stand back. She swiped the keycard through the reader. The door clicked open with a soft hiss, revealing a large, dimly lit office. There, sitting behind a massive desk, was the architect. He was exactly as Maggie had imagined. Calm, collected, a man who had built an empire on manipulation and fear. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling calm as he regarded them, his hands resting easily on the desk in front of him. "You made it," the architect said, his voice smooth, almost casual. "I didn't expect you to get this far, but I must admit, you're persistent." Maggie didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice cold and unwavering. "It's over, architect. Your reign ends tonight." The architect smiled, a dangerous, knowing grin. "You think you can take me down? You're just one woman and a couple of soldiers. Do you have any idea how much power I hold?" Roy's hand went to the grip of his gun, his posture tense, ready for the inevitable fight. Jim's eyes flicked around the room, scanning for exits and potential threats. "You're nothing without the fear you've instilled in others," Maggie said, her voice steady, "and I'm not afraid of you." For a moment, the architect said nothing. His smile never wavered, but something in his eyes flickered. Maybe it was surprise. Maybe it was something else. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. Maggie knew they had to act now. Before the architect could make his next move, there was a sudden sound. A muffled explosion from the far side of the building. The walls shuddered, and the lights flickered. Maggie's heart raced. It was a diversion. Roy and Jim had set it up to flush out any guards hidden inside the building. The architect stood, his calm demeanor slowly cracking as the noise grew louder. "You think this will stop me?" he sneered. "My people are everywhere." But Maggie didn't wait for him to finish. In a flash, she drew her gun and pointed it at his chest. "I've already beaten you," she said simply. The room fell silent. The tension was so thick that Maggie could almost feel it pressing in on her chest. The architect stood motionless, his expression unreadable. The air seemed to hang heavy around them, as though time itself was waiting for the final blow. Then, without warning, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was Elias, the very man who had led them here, the man who had given them the final piece of the puzzle. "No," Elias said quietly, his voice laced with regret. "You don't understand. The architect is just a figurehead. The real power, it's never been him. It's me." Maggie's mind raced as she processed his words. She had trusted Elias, believed in him. But in that instant, it all became clear. Elias had never been on their side. He had been playing them, using them to get closer to the architect's operations. The power he craved was within his reach. "I knew you were too good to be true," Maggie said, her voice low but filled with disgust. The architect gave a soft laugh, as if amused by the revelation. "You should have known better. Elias was always the one pulling the strings. He's the one you should have been worried about." Elias stepped forward, his hand going to the gun holstered at his side. "It's over, Maggie. You've lost." In that moment, everything became a blur. Roy and Jim moved, their guns drawn, and chaos erupted in the office. The room filled with the deafening sound of gunfire, and Maggie's heart pounded as she tried to focus on the target in front of her. She couldn't let Elias win. With a swift motion, she dove behind cover, her gun aimed squarely at Elias. "You'll never control this city." In the chaos that followed, Maggie found herself facing Elias one final time. The man she had once trusted, the man who had led them to this moment, now standing as her enemy. With one final shot, Maggie ended it. The office was silent once more. The architect was gone, and Elias lay on the floor. The team stood together, victorious, though the cost had been high. Maggie looked down at the man who had orchestrated so much pain and destruction. The city was free from his grip, but the road ahead was still uncertain. The syndicate was in shambles, but its influence still lingered in the shadows. They had won the battle, but the war, that would take time. As Maggie stood, looking out over the city, she knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Thanks for following Maggie and the team on their journey. What do you think will happen now that the architect and Elias are gone? Will the city finally heal? Or will new challenges arise from the ashes of the syndicate? Stay tuned for more.